A lone cabin, perched at the edge of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, stands silent in the icy gloom. The wind howls past crooked pines, and snowfall muffles the world in ghostly silence. Inside, a man named Ethan presses one ear against the door he has barred with all his might, heart hammering with every scrape on the wood. On the other side, a mother bear and her cubs claw for entrance, driven by desperation and hunger in this frigid wilderness. The next twist sends Ethan's pulse into overdrive, because sometimes the unexpected isn't just outside one's door, but already tangled in one's heart. Snow fell in a slow, unhurried dance across the Kenai Peninsula. The wind carried echoes of winter's chill, sweeping across ridges, down through the trees, and finally around the snug wooden cabin that overlooked the icy blue waters of Kenai Lake. In this remote land, the horizon stretched in a quiet hush that only nature could conjure. Ethan Carlyle stood by the frost-streaked window, watching the last blade of sunlight slip behind the mountains. Each day felt shorter here, each night darker, and in that darkness, memories so often found their way to the surface. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was the sudden drop in temperature, or the unusual hush that blanketed the clearing. No caw of a raven, no rustle of branches, only the hush of swirling snow and his own breath. The cabin itself was modest, 4 walls of sturdy timber, the same cabin his father had built many years ago with the dream of forging a life off the grid. The furnishings were practical: a small table near the fireplace, a bookshelf of dog-eared favorites, and a single rocking chair shaped by the calluses of generations. Its seat bore ghosts of the past, and sometimes, when the wind was just right, Ethan felt as though he could hear voices echoing in the old wood. A battered sign reading Carlisle Cabin Welcome, Old Friend, hung crookedly by the front door. His father, Michael Carlisle, had carved those words back when hope felt infinite. Ethan ran his fingers over the carved letters sometimes, remembering the family outings, the stories told over campfires, and the long, meandering fishing trips down the Kenai River. That was before his father's health had begun to fail, and before Ethan drifted away, chasing big city ambitions that only left him emptier inside. He was here now, not entirely by choice, but because he couldn't bear to sell the place after his father's passing. It fell to him to decide its fate, and something in him hesitated. Maybe it was guilt, or a longing for the roots he'd severed too hastily. So he returned to Kenai Peninsula, prepared to ride out a solitary winter in the cabin, far from the hustle and heartbreak that had colored the last few years of his life. As the fireplace crackled, Ethan propped more logs onto the dancing flames. Embers sparked in a splash of gold. The warmth was welcoming, but an undercurrent of foreboding trickled through him. Living alone had sharpened his instincts for the subtle changes in his environment. The entire day, his hackles had been raised, as though he'd stepped into an invisible tension with the wilderness. Perhaps he was just jumpy, having spent so much time in the city's neon glow. He shut his eyes, briefly recalling the final days with his father in Anchorage's Providence Hospital. Under the harsh fluorescence, Michael Carlisle had squeezed Ethan's hand and said, "Take care of the cabin for me. Don't let your mother's memory go." His father never asked for much, but he'd made Ethan promise. That promise weighed heavy on him. After the funeral, as relatives scattered to their own lives, the cabin up here felt like the only anchor he had left. So he came, seeking quiet, healing, or perhaps just an escape from the swirl of regrets. A violent gust rapped against the window, snapping Ethan out of his reverie. The glass shuddered, and he hurried to pull the curtains shut. He adjusted his father's old rifle, something he rarely used, above the mantel. While it offered some sense of safety, Ethan couldn't forget that the greatest threats in these wilds often came unseen, from the biting cold or a subtle misstep on ice. Usually, If you gave animals space and respect, they gave the same in return. But as night settled, a sense of disquiet ballooned. He finished his simple dinner of canned stew and a piece of cornbread left over from breakfast. Then a sound pricked his ears, the faintest scratching at the cabin door. At first, he suspected wind-blown branches. The nearest pine was about 3 feet from the porch. Yet this sound was a steady scrape, measured and determined. He set the bowl aside, heart pacing. Another scratch came, followed by a low, almost pitiful whine. He approached the door cautiously, pressed an ear against it, and froze. Through the thick wood, he heard heavy breathing and the rustling thud of something big leaning against the frame. The hair on his arms stood on end. Bears often passed through these woods in search of a meal. In the summertime, you could spot them along Kenai River, scooping salmon from the rushing currents. But in the dead of winter, sightings were rare and dangerous. The mother bears that did remain active might still be nursing or protecting cubs. If they hadn't fully hibernated, any disturbance could be deadly. And yet, something about the soft whine stirred an uneasy empathy within him. A more insistent scraping forced him to step back. He glanced at the rifle, heart racing, but something told him to hold off. Instead, he lifted the shutter on the small window beside the door. Peering out, he saw a dark mass shuffling. At first, he couldn't distinguish shape from shadow, but then 2 small lumps tumbled over each other. Cubs, he realized, and a mother massive and hunched, with winter fur bristling. She pressed her muzzle to the door as if sensing the heat from within. It was a sight to freeze a man's blood. If the mother felt threatened, she might charge. If he welcomed her in, that might be equally disastrous. A swirl of panic hammered at Ethan's chest. He'd spent childhood vacations learning the basics of bear safety: store food properly, keep your distance, never feed them directly, and certainly never open your door to them. But when he saw the mother turn her head, revealing bones jutting through her hide, an unmistakable thinness for a creature that should have been hibernating, a pang of pity lanced through him. The cubs stumbled around her feet, scratching as well. Their fur was patchy. They appeared undernourished, eyes dull with exhaustion. One of them let out a feeble squeak. The mother turned to lick it, leaving a smear of blood on its muzzle, fresh from some small prey she must have caught before trudging here. Ethan's thoughts raced. Could they smell the remains of the stew he'd just cooked, or were they simply desperate for any hint of warmth? He stepped away from the window, each breath shaky. This was insane. There was no scenario in which letting these animals inside was safe, but ignoring their plight felt impossible. He recalled something he read in a local wildlife management guide. Sometimes, in brutal winters, starving mother bears might roam beyond their usual territory, desperate to feed and protect their young. They might even approach human dwellings as a last resort. How had the hunger grown so dire that this mother risked her life and the lives of her cubs to come here? He rummaged through a small closet, found a flare gun and a small air horn. Safety measures. He considered using them to scare the bears away, but a wave of guilt churned in his gut. They might freeze to death, might starve. Still, letting them linger was a risk. If the mother became aggressive, or if she felt threatened in any way, the results could be catastrophic. Ethan took a breath, forced calm. He wondered if he could toss some scraps far from the cabin to lure them away, perhaps to a safer distance. But that risked teaching them to associate his cabin with food, a cardinal sin for living around wildlife. Yet these animals were on the brink. The mother's coat carried the dusty dryness of starvation. The cubs, tiny forms, seemed too frail. Another scratch startled him. Then came a momentary lull. Silence. He peered through the window again. The mother had backed away, her gaze traveling across the door, the windows, searching for an opening. The cubs huddled behind her, their little bodies shivering in the cold. Overhead, the moonlight fell across the clearing, illuminating their gaunt silhouettes against the snow. Desperation gnawed at Ethan's heart. This was the kind of dilemma that not even his father's stories had prepared him for. Memories flickered, a time they'd stumbled upon a black bear sow and her cubs on a fishing trip. His father had swiftly guided Ethan away, whispering about the sacredness of a mother's protectiveness. They'd retreated without incident, but now there was no easy retreat. Steeling himself, Ethan inched open the shutters on a second window, this one next to the porch. Leaning out cautiously, he tried to speak in a calm tone. "Easy, girl, easy," he called, though his voice trembled. The mother bear's ears twitched. She paused, head lifting to the sound. Her eyes glinted in the moonlight, but he sensed fear more than hostility. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry," he whispered. Part of him felt foolish, as though he expected the bear to understand his words. Yet in that moment, he felt a connection, a spark of empathy, bridging the boundary between man and beast. He closed the shutters, slid to the floor, and clutched his head. What to do? Images flashed through his mind, the cubs succumbing to the cold, the mother's frantic attempts to keep them alive. A swirl of grief welled from some deep place he rarely visited. He remembered his father's condition worsening, how powerless he had felt. He remembered the sorrow of losing his mother in a car accident when he was just a child. He remembered nights in this very cabin, hearing the wind outside, feeling safe only because both his parents were by his side. And now he was alone, faced with a choice that felt bigger than him. He forced himself to think logically. If he didn't act, the mother might break in, or she might succumb to the cold, leaving the cubs orphaned. If he tried to feed them from inside, that would only aggravate the situation. The only reasonable thing might be to attempt to scare them away. But the moral weight pressed heavily on him, stifling rationalities. For the next hour he paced, ears tuned to the scraping outside. Occasionally he heard a faint whine. The cubs, he realized, were whimpering from cold or hunger. Something twisted in his chest, some unstoppable wave of empathy. This was beyond mere pity. It felt like a cosmic test, as though nature itself was asking, "Are you still capable of compassion for the wild things?" At last, he decided on a compromise. With trembling hands, he took a chunk of leftover cornbread and the scraps of stew from his bowl, placing them in an old metal bucket. He bundled up in his heaviest coat, tugged on thick gloves, and mustered the courage to step outside through the back door. He'd leave the scraps at a distance, maybe near the edge of the clearing, then return inside, hoping the bears would smell the food and lead themselves away without direct confrontation. He crept around the cabin's perimeter, boots crunching softly on the snow. The wind bit at his nose. Circling to the front, he heard the mother's labored breathing, saw her looming shape by the porch steps. The cubs huddled under her belly, trembling. Setting the bucket down about 20 yards away, Ethan whispered into the night, "Go on. There's food here." His breath steamed in the cold, the sky unbelievably vast overhead. Stars prickled like shards of ice. He wanted to scurry back inside immediately, but he forced himself to wait, letting the mother catch his scent. She sniffed the air, swiveling her great head. Their gazes met. For a moment, time froze. Her muzzle twitched, and she let out a grumbling sound, half warning, half question. Ethan took a step back, tried to appear as unthreatening as possible. He had an air horn in his pocket if she charged. His heart thrummed. Then, slowly, she prowled forward, the cubs stumbling at her flank. She sniffed the air again, caught the aroma of stew. Her eyes flicked to him once more, as if to gauge whether it was a trap. Ethan took another slow step backward. The mother continued her cautious approach to the bucket. She nudged it with her nose, sending it clattering softly. The cubs scurried forward, sniffing, then started to lick hungrily at the scraps. The mother lowered her head, muzzle pressing into the metal, devouring bits of cornbread A swirl of relief and uncertainty welled in Ethan's chest. He'd broken a fundamental rule: never feed the wildlife, but desperation overshadowed that principle tonight. He simply couldn't let them starve at his doorstep. He took another step back, inching toward the porch, never taking his eyes off the mother. She growled softly, but it wasn't an aggressive challenge, more a guarded warning not to come closer. With careful, deliberate steps, Ethan reached the cabin door. Once inside, he bolted the latch and peered through a corner of the window. The mother and cubs continued to feed, gulping down every morsel. When they finished, she sniffed around the bucket, searching for more. After a few moments, she looked back at the cabin, then up at the sky. The cold wind ruffled her fur. Unable to scent additional food, she settled onto her haunches, the cubs curling up against her flank. Ethan exhaled. He realized that he'd have to keep an eye on them. Perhaps in the morning they would move on, or perhaps not. His act of compassion might have bound him in ways he hadn't foreseen. Yet some part of him felt relief. Even in the starkness of winter, in the midst of his own grief, he'd found a capacity to care. Maybe that was what he needed to prove to himself, that life could still flow from him in the form of empathy, instead of just sorrow and regret. That night, he barely slept. He kept the fire burning, listening to the soft wails of wind. Occasionally, he checked outside, seeing the mother curled up in the same spot. The cubs scarcely left her side. Once, Ethan thought he heard them scratching again, but it was only one of the cubs stumbling around, perhaps disoriented or curious. He considered stepping out again, but prudence anchored him. The food he'd given was enough for one night. Instead, he found his father's old journal on a shelf, the binding cracked with age. He flipped through pages of neat handwriting describing fishing spots, hunting anecdotes, and notes about the local wildlife. One entry in particular spoke about a time Michael Carlyle found a wounded moose near the property, how he'd tried to nurse it back to health, though the attempt ultimately failed. Sometimes, Michael wrote, we do what's in our power to ease suffering, even if we can't save them all. Compassion is never wasted, though it may be tested. Ethan ran a finger over those words, feeling as though they were meant for him tonight. Morning brought a pale sun that glinted off the snow. Ethan roused himself from an uneasy sleep. Despite the exhaustion tugging at his eyes, he threw on his coat and cautiously went outside. The crisp air stung his lungs, and the sky glowed a bright shade of winter blue. He circled to where he'd left the bears. They were gone. For an instant, relief swept through him. Perhaps they'd moved on, found a place to hunker down, or discovered another food source. Yet worry trailed close behind the relief. Would they be okay? He walked through the clearing, scanning for paw prints. Sure enough, he found a clear trail heading deeper into the trees. Part of him wanted to follow, to ensure their well-being, but reason prevailed. These were wild animals. He had no business intruding further. Returning to the cabin, he brewed coffee on the wood stove. The day wore on quietly. He kept busy with small chores, chopping wood, checking the generator, tidying the storage shed. The sky shifted from a pale morning haze to a brilliant midday shine, and then to the mellow gold of late afternoon. As dusk edged in, Ethan caught himself glancing at the tree line more often than usual, wondering if they would return. His silent question was answered a few hours after sunset. He was tidying dishes by the sink when the scratching returned, softer this time. Heart-pounding, he looked through the window. The mother bear stood at the edge of the porch, the cubs peeking around her legs. She sniffed the air, eyes flicking toward the window as if searching for him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Had she come back, expecting more food? He grabbed the bucket from last night, placed a small portion of stew scraps and a bit of stale bread inside. Nervously, he stepped out onto the porch. The mother tensed, lowering her head. The cubs pressed against her. "It's okay," he murmured. He set the bucket near the porch steps, then backed away. The mother advanced warily, cubs in tow. They devoured the meal without the same desperation as the previous night, but still with evident hunger. This pattern repeated over the next few days. The mother bear seemed to have chosen a spot nearby, returning each evening. If Ethan didn't put out scraps, she'd scratch at the door, though never aggressively enough to break it down. It was a reluctant partnership, one Ethan grappled with morally each time he caved and fed them. He knew the risks, dependency, potential aggression, the chance of a run-in if the mother associated all humans with food. But a deeper force compelled him. He couldn't bear the thought of them starving within earshot. The cubs grew bolder. Sometimes Ethan cracked the door open to see them pouring at the porch, wide-eyed. They let out high-pitched squeaks, seemingly curious about this human. The mother always kept a cautious watch, a low rumble in her throat if Ethan stepped too close. Even as an unspoken trust formed between them, Ethan knew it was precarious. He tried to ration his food offerings, ensuring they remained small. After all, his own supplies were finite, and he was no wildlife rehabilitator. But each night, hearing the cubs mewling and seeing the mother's gaunt body, he couldn't withhold help. Days lengthened into a routine. Ethan ventured out to gather firewood, sometimes glimpsing the mother bear and cubs near the frozen stream downhill. They never approached him in daylight, keeping a safe distance. Often, Ethan felt a flutter in his chest, torn between wonder and trepidation. He'd stand still, letting them observe him for a moment, then carry on. Nights brought the now familiar scratch, and Ethan would feed them. Even as the routine took hold, a sense of foreboding lurked in Ethan's mind. Something about the way the mother watched him, a glint of fierce intelligence or desperation, made him wonder if she was deciding how far to trust him, or if she was sizing him up in case her cubs needed more. 2 weeks passed in this strange ritual. The mother bear's thinness improved slightly, and the cubs seemed livelier. During daylight, Ethan took solitary walks along Kenai Lake's shoreline, letting the water's frozen expanse remind him how small he was in this world. He thought often of his father, how he'd handle such a delicate situation. A better man might have known precisely what to do, call a wildlife ranger, perhaps. But Ethan was torn. The local rangers might insist on relocating or euthanizing a mother bear who'd grown too comfortable near humans. He wanted to avoid that outcome, though it might be inevitable if the situation escalated. During these weeks, Ethan also found himself reflecting on the choices that led him here. In the city, he'd thrown himself into a corporate job that devoured his time and moral compass. He'd lost meaningful friendships, let romantic relationships slip through his fingers because he couldn't handle emotional vulnerability. Worse, he distanced himself from his father during the elder's last years, visiting only when guilt overcame him. He'd missed the subtle joys and truths that life offered, truths he could have learned from Michael Carlyle's quiet wisdom. Now, on the cusp of a harsh winter, communing daily with a starving mother bear, Ethan felt as though the universe was giving him a lesson he'd refused for too long: compassion, responsibility, connection. The mother bear taught him caution, the cubs awakened his dormant tenderness, and the wilderness made him realize how reliant we are on each other for survival. In late December, a fierce storm loomed on the horizon. Heavy snowfalls and sub-zero temperatures were forecast to sweep across the Kenai Peninsula. On the radio, a crackling voice warned, blizzard conditions expected, high winds and dangerous wind chills. Ethan felt the tension coil in his stomach. The mother bear and cubs had no secure den he was aware of. If they'd had one, they likely would have holed up long ago. How would they survive a storm that could last days? He fretted over it, pacing inside the cabin, checking his own provisions. He had enough food to last several weeks if careful. Firewood was abundant, but more might be needed if the winds howled too violently. Meanwhile, the mother bear and cubs had grown reliant on his small offerings. A part of him chastised himself. I've stepped into a role I can't fulfill. He wasn't some wilderness savior. He was just a man trying to make up for past failings. As the skies darkened with heavy clouds, Ethan prepared for the worst. He hammered extra boards over the windows to brace them, stacked firewood inside. The bears showed up earlier that evening, their posture uneasy as the wind began to whip. Snow started to fall in sheets. Their fur clung to their thin frames. Ethan's stomach knotted. If he turned them away now, they might freeze out there. A wild idea took hold. Could he possibly let them shelter in his attached shed? The old storage area was connected to the cabin by a single door, mostly used for tools and a small workshop space. It offered minimal warmth, but it was enclosed from the wind and snow. It wouldn't be comfortable or entirely safe, but it was better than the brutal conditions outside. Yet the idea terrified him. Letting a mother bear and her cubs that close to his living space was a gamble. Still, the thought of them pinned against a tree in a howling blizzard felt more merciless. That night, with the storm intensifying, Ethan donned his thick parka, readied the flare gun, and carefully made his way onto the porch. The mother and cubs stood half buried in fresh snow. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The wind roared, swirling white flurries all around. His voice trembled as he motioned toward the shed door. "Come on," he shouted over the wind, though he doubted she understood. He pried open the workshop door and tossed some scraps inside, a meager lure. At first, the mother hesitated, sniffing the air. The cubs watched from behind her, trembling in the gale. After a few tense moments, she followed the scent, stepping gingerly into the shed. The cubs scampered close behind. Ethan's heart pounded. He retreated quickly, leaving the door partially open so they wouldn't feel trapped. Then he hustled back into the cabin, latched the connecting door from his side. The last thing he wanted was to barge in on a mother bear, but at least they had a small refuge from the wind. Thunderous gusts rattled the cabin through the night. The storm battered the roof, howled down the chimney. For a few nerve-wracking hours, Ethan could hear the mother bear shifting in the shed, grunting softly, the cubs squeaking. His mind raced with what-ifs. What if she tore through the workshop? What if the shed collapsed under the weight of snow? What if, come morning, they turned on him, sensing his proximity? Despite the swirl of dread, a gentle warmth bloomed inside him. They were safer now, out of the storm. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this protective, this responsible for another living being. Something about that realization made his throat tighten, tears threatening to surface. The old guilt about not doing enough for his father, about not saving his mother all those years ago, mixed with a sliver of redemption. Maybe, in this small corner of the world, he could tip the scales in favor of life. For 3 days, the storm raged. Snow piled high, sealing Ethan inside. He labored to keep a path clear to the shed. Each time he opened the cabin door, icy wind clawed at him. The mother bear stayed mostly hidden from sight, though sometimes he heard her behind the shed's interior wall, pacing or grunting to her cubs. The connecting door was old, made of sturdy oak. It had 2 locks, both of which Ethan kept bolted. Still, he found himself pressing an ear against it at intervals, listening for trouble. Occasionally, he placed a small dish of water on his side of the threshold. He didn't open it fully, just cracked it enough to slide water or scraps through, then quickly closed it. Each time, the mother or cubs would lap it up. On one occasion, he glimpsed her dark muzzle. His heart lurched, half in fear, half in a strange sense of communion. The mother bear locked eyes with him for a single moment before he shut the door again, uncertain whether he was crossing a line he could never revert. Outside, the blizzard hammered relentlessly. On the second night, the wind shrieked so fiercely that Ethan feared the roof might lift off. He crouched by the fireplace, arms around his knees, remembering childhood nights when storms rattled the cabin, but he'd always felt safe in his parents' presence. Now, ironically, the one presence that offered a sense of shared vulnerability was a mother bear, separated by just a few inches of timber. At times, Ethan whispered into the void, confiding regrets he'd never told a soul. He spoke of how he wished he'd returned sooner to help his father in his final days, how he regretted letting his paternal relationship languish. Words slipped out in half-choked sobs. He didn't expect an answer, of course, but voicing them felt like exhaling a burden. The roar of the wind and the faint movements of the bears beyond the door seemed to hold space for his confession, a silent witness to his penance. On the morning of the fourth day, the storm finally broke. A weak sun filtered through swirling flurries. Ethan rose stiffly, mouth dry, and braced himself for whatever lay in the shed. Cautiously, he opened the cabin door to check the snowdrifts, stepping out onto the porch. The wind had calmed, though the drifts reached waist-high in some spots. Grabbing a shovel, he began the laborious process of clearing a path around the cabin. When he finally made his way to the shed's exterior, he noticed something alarming. The workshop door was ajar, snow blowing in. Inside were large paw prints and a few scattered items, a broken lantern, knocked over tools. Breath catching in his throat, he realized the mother bear must have pushed through sometime in the night or early morning, searching for a way out or exploring. He followed the tracks around the corner of the cabin, where they led to a partially collapsed pine tree. The footprints continued into the forest, joined by smaller sets, clearly the cubs. They must have decided to leave once the wind died down. Ethan's heart lurched with worry and relief. At least they'd survived the worst of it. He was about to turn back when he noticed something else, more bear tracks converging near the property. But these were bigger, deeper. He knelt, pressing a palm to the print. Much larger than the mother's, a boar possibly. A male bear. That spelled danger. If a hungry male bear crossed paths with a mother and cubs, violence could ensue. Male bears sometimes killed cubs to force the sow back into mating condition or to claim territory. Anxiety churned in Ethan's stomach. He followed the fresh tracks a short distance into the trees, where they overlapped with the mother bears. Signs of a struggle appeared in the churned-up snow, broken branches and droplets of blood. Panic sparked. Had there been a confrontation? He recalled that female bears could be vicious defenders of their cubs. Driven by dread, Ethan continued onward until the tracks disappeared behind a thick stand of spruces. He found no sign of the mother or her cubs, but the scattered blood droplets told a grim story. Unsure what else to do, he hurried back to the shed to check the extent of damage. Tools were scattered, old jars smashed. The smell of bear lingered. A corner of his workshop table was shredded. He let out a long exhale. Part of him felt a wave of frustration. He'd given them shelter, and they'd trashed the place. But another part of him couldn't blame them. They were wild animals, terrified, searching for survival. Over the next few hours, he tried to settle back into a post-storm routine. He fixed the workshop door with a makeshift latch, cleared additional snow from around the cabin, and tidied the interior. But his mind kept drifting to the mother bear and her cubs. Were they alive? Injured? Was the mother maimed after fighting off the male? The sense of responsibility he'd taken on gnawed at him. Late in the afternoon, as he rummaged through his father's old supplies, he came across a battered first aid kit for animals. Michael Carlyle had once rescued a wounded sled dog, nursing it back to health. The kit contained bandages, antiseptic, and a small stash of medicine for cuts or minor infections. The idea of tending to a wild bear's injuries was absurd, but something told Ethan to keep it close, just in case. 3 days passed without a sign of the mother bear or her cubs. The forest felt eerily still. A thin gloom settled in Ethan's chest, a resignation that maybe nature had taken its course. Then, on a frigid afternoon when the sun cast long shadows across the clearing, he heard a familiar sound at the door, this time weaker, more desperate. A scratch, followed by a faint moan. Heart pounding, Ethan crept to the door. Outside stood the mother bear, alone. Blood matted her fur near the shoulder, and she limped badly, favoring her right front leg. One cub lay sprawled beside her, unmoving. The second cub nuzzled at its sibling, whining helplessly. Terror and heartbreak slammed into Ethan. He unlatched the door a fraction, peering out. The mother bear let out a low, guttural sound. Was she begging for help, or was that a warning? Her eyes, usually intense, seemed dull. She made no move to charge him. Instead, she lowered her head, nuzzling the still cub. No response. A sob caught in Ethan's throat. Was the cub dead? His gaze snapped to the mother's wound, a deep gash, likely from a fight. Blood trickled down her leg, staining the snow. She swayed on her feet, on the verge of collapse. This was beyond a fleeting act of compassion. It was a crisis. If he did nothing, mother and surviving cub might both die. He threw caution to the wind. Unlocking the door fully, he grabbed a small hunk of fish from the kitchen and placed it outside. The mother bear teetered forward, sniffing. She managed a few bites. The surviving cub clung to her side, trembling. The other cub remained motionless. Ethan sank to his knees inside the doorway, tears burning his eyes. He whispered, "I'm so sorry." The mother bear lumbered closer to the threshold. This time, fear surged in Ethan. This was an apex predator, wounded or not. But her posture spoke not of aggression. It carried a plea he couldn't deny. She let out a short, soft grunt, glancing at her dead cub, then at Ethan, then at her own wound. An impossible choice confronted him: rush them away with flares or try to help. He had the animal first aid kit. Could he even attempt to clean her wound without being mauled? And what about the dead cub? A surge of clarity overcame him. Do what you can, do what you must. He grabbed a thick towel, the first aid kit, and a length of rope to use as a tourniquet if needed. Then he placed a few more scraps of food to distract her. Slowly, step by step, heart thundering, he inched onto the porch. The mother bear bared her teeth briefly, a warning, but didn't attack. She was too weak. Her eyes flicked from him to the food, to the limp cub. Kneeling a few feet away, Ethan steeled himself. He extended the towel, showing her he meant no harm. She let out a labored breath. The surviving cub squealed, staggering behind its mother. He began to clean around the wound, gently wiping away blood. Every time she flinched, he jerked back, expecting her to snap. But she remained still, occasionally letting out a soft growl. He dabbed antiseptic on the gash, the mother bear trembling but not lashing out. This close, he could smell her raw, earthy musk, see the raggedness of her fur. Compassion and awe warred within him. When he finished, she slumped to the ground, panting. The surviving cub climbed onto her back, nuzzling its mother. Ethan exhaled, tears sliding down his cheeks. He had never felt such a profound sense of connection. She, a wounded mother bear, had placed a tenuous trust in him, a human who had once fed her scraps. In that fragile moment, man and beast bridged an ancient divide, bonded by shared vulnerability. Then his eyes fell on the still form of the second cub, lying in the snow. He moved toward it, hands shaking. The mother bear watched, eyes brimming with sorrow. Gently, Ethan lifted the tiny body. It was still warm, but there was no heartbeat, no breath. He set it aside on the porch, heart throbbing. The mother bear let out a long, mournful moan that cut straight through the silent clearing. The surviving cub echoed that cry, as if searching for its sibling. Night crept in, quiet and haunting. Ethan fashioned a makeshift bandage on the mother's shoulder, hoping it would help stem infection. He offered her water and some food. She ate listlessly. With trembling care, he carried the dead cub's body to a nearby patch of soft snow, wishing he had the means to bury it properly. The mother bear shifted her weight, glancing at him, then at her lost cub, as if torn between guarding the body and tending to her living child. Ultimately, Ethan stayed on the porch, eyes wet, murmuring gentle words he knew she couldn't understand. In that hush, sorrow united them. Death had stolen something precious from her, just as it had stolen from him in the past. There were no illusions of domestication or pet-like relationships here. This was raw, visceral nature. Yet, in that rawness, a bond of empathy pulsed. The following morning, Ethan woke to find the mother bear and her living cub curled near the porch. She couldn't travel far with that wound, especially not without proper healing. Over the next few days, an extraordinary dance of trust developed. Ethan would cautiously tend to her injury, offering small amounts of food and water. The mother bear tolerated his presence, perhaps recognizing that his care was her best chance of survival. He kept the workshop door open so she could shelter inside if needed. She did, occasionally, to escape the worst of the cold. The cub, now alone in its siblings' absence, explored timidly. Ethan was careful never to push them too far. He let them come and go, mindful of boundaries. Sometimes in the gloom of twilight, he'd hear the mother bear's mournful rumble near the spot he'd left her dead cub's body. The sound cut into him like a blade. In caring for them, Ethan felt a wellspring of healing within himself. He was no longer the isolated man buried under guilt. He was an active participant in preserving life. Each time, he changed the mother's bandage, stroking her fur gently to keep her calm. He whispered confessions about his regrets, about missing his father's final moments of lucidity. He spoke of how he'd once resented the cabin, how he blamed it for stealing family vacations, for confining him away from friends back in his youth. Yet, ironically, here he was, discovering the cabin's deeper purpose, a sanctuary for both man and beast. Gradually, the mother bear's wound improved. She remained thin, but her eyes regained a sharper clarity. The cub grew, wrestling with Ethan's stacked firewood or pawing at the porch steps. As January gave way to February 2013, the harshness of winter eased slightly, though snow still blanketed the land. There were nights of stinging cold, but also days when the sun shone brighter and the forest seemed less foreboding. Ethan contemplated calling local wildlife services more than once, especially after the cub's death, but each time he hesitated, worried that authorities might kill or relocate the mother. Perhaps it was arrogance or ignorance to think he alone could solve this. Still, he told himself he'd contact them if she showed signs of deeper illness or aggression. For now, the fragile equilibrium held. Each morning he woke to check on them. Sometimes they were gone, presumably for short hunts or scavenging. But they'd return near dusk, the mother letting out a soft chuff to announce her presence. Ethan even began leaving the workshop door partially open in his absence. Astoundingly, she and the cub never made a mess inside again, as if sensing it was a shared space, not a threat. It was a precarious harmony, but it worked. Late one afternoon, Ethan heard the distant hum of a helicopter. Startled, he stepped outside. Flying low over the treetops, an Alaska fish and game chopper skimmed the horizon. Panic constricted Ethan's chest. Were they on patrol, checking for wildlife disturbances? Had a neighbor reported unusual bear sightings? He watched the helicopter until it disappeared, an uneasy feeling gnawing at him. If they found out about this arrangement, the consequences for the mother bear could be dire. He quietly decided that if the mother and cub looked strong enough to survive on their own soon, he would encourage them to move deeper into the wilderness. Spring would come in time, the salmon would run in the Kenai River, and life would bloom anew. That cycle was unstoppable. For a mother bear, the wild was her rightful home, not a corner of a man's shed. She needed to rejoin the rhythms of nature, not remain tethered to his supplies. A couple of weeks later, near the edge of March, the mother bear's limp had all but disappeared. Her fur had regained some sheen. The cub scampered with more energy, venturing a bit farther each day. Ethan felt both relief and a pang of sorrow. He sensed their bond might be nearing its end. A few times, the mother bear strode to the top of a small ridge behind the cabin, gazing across the wilderness. She seemed restless, as if remembering she belonged to a broader domain. One evening she didn't return until well after midnight. Ethan found himself peeking outside, anxious. When she finally arrived, she had a fresh kill, a hare clenched in her jaws, the cub trotting proudly beside her. She ate it near the edge of the clearing, ignoring the scraps Ethan offered. A silent signal she could fend for herself. He watched from the porch, a mixture of pride and sadness swirling within him. Soon she wouldn't need him at all. That was how it was meant to be, yet a subtle ache nestled in his heart. Finally, on a crisp morning, Ethan woke to a profound quiet. No paw prints on the porch, no scratch at the door. He scanned the clearing, circling the property. Nothing. A part of him hoped they'd return by dusk, but they didn't. Days passed. The mother bear and her cub were gone, presumably heading deeper into the mountains or toward more abundant feeding grounds. He tried not to dwell on the emptiness that replaced their presence. Instead, he reminded himself that this was nature's design. The mother was healthier. Now, the cub had grown stronger. They had survived one of the harshest winters in memory. And in helping them, Ethan found a strange kind of redemption. He had, in a small way, upheld the legacy of compassion his father once taught him. Spring arrived in subtle bursts, icicles dripping from the cabin eaves, patches of green peeking through the melting snow, birds returning with their morning chorus. Ethan decided to remain in the cabin indefinitely. The land called to him, tethering him to a sense of purpose he'd never found in the city. He began renovating the cabin, making it more livable for longer stretches. He replaced broken boards, repainted the interior, and even added a small greenhouse for herbs. Some days, he took long treks into the forest, scanning for signs of the mother bear. He spotted footprints once or twice, faint clues that she was around, yet she never approached the cabin again. Perhaps she remembered the kindness, but her instincts told her to keep her distance. Time soothed the raw edges of his grief. Ethan no longer felt haunted by the spectre of missed chances. Instead, he felt guided by an abiding gratitude for the wild things that taught him how to reach beyond his own sorrow, how to risk everything for another's life. He stood at the lakeshore one balmy afternoon in May, watching a swirl of fish near the surface. Maybe the mother bear was out there somewhere, teaching her cub to fish for salmon in these same waters. He liked to imagine them thriving, forging their own path. Nature had tested them all, but in that test, a quiet, enduring bond was formed. It dwelled in the silent places between the forest and the human heart, a testament to how even the most unexpected connections could shape a life forever. Thank you, dear listeners, for journeying with me through the bone-chilling nights and the heartwarming bond that formed between a solitary man and a mother bear on the beautiful, yet unforgiving Kenai Peninsula. If this story touched you, if you felt the tension, the sorrow, and the sudden flicker of hope, please take a moment to reflect on our own capacity for compassion and resilience. It's in our darkest moments that kindness finds a way to shine, bridging divides we once deemed impossible. If you enjoyed this immersive tale, please like this video to show your support, share it with friends and family who appreciate heart-pounding adventure mixed with emotional depth, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that celebrate the power of the human spirit and our connection to the natural world. Together, we keep these stories alive, inspiring hope one view at a time. Thank you, and stay inspired.